Welcome to this quick review on understanding and avoiding plagiarism. In this brief video, we're going to answer 3 questions. How is plagiarism defined? How can plagiarism be avoided? And what tools do we use to detect plagiarism? As we begin, we want to talk about some terminology that we use when we talk about someone's or using somebody's work. The first one is plagiarism, which we define as the act of simply stealing someone else's work and attempting to pass it off as your own. This can apply to anything from papers to photographs to songs, even ideas. It's also defined as the misappropriation of materials, such as facts, ideas, words, or structures that were created, originated, or discovered by someone else. Misappropriation means that it is misused according to the social content that it exists within. This means that communities set standards for use when reuse of material is plagiarism and when it is not, and we should learn and abide by that community's standards. The academic community has very high standards for using and citing sources. We use the term plagiarism in the context of our classrooms as a way to distinguish or as a way to set up guidelines for how you would appropriately use or integrate the research of others into your own work. But we also want to understand the idea of copyright. Copyright is a form of protection provided by the laws of the United States to the authors of original works of authorship, including literary, dramatic, musical, artistic, and certain other intellectual works. This protection is available to both published and unpublished works, and when something is copyrighted, it gives explicit permission to only those who own the copyright to duplicate the material. We also want to take into consideration fair use. Fair use is a statute under copyright law that allows for the use of limited portions of a work that has copyright without having to have permission from the original author. It was created for the purposes of education and research. It's a little harder to pin down than plagiarism or copyright. What qualifies as limited portion? So as you can see, these terms begin to get a little slippery. The Copyright Office isn't very helpful on defining what a limited portion is. It only states that there are no specific number of words, lines, or notes that may be safely taken without permission. So when we look at the infographic on the left, you see that fair use is in the middle, and then outside of that spans these different avenues. For example, it's considered fair use if the commercial value of the original is not diminished, meaning that you've used a portion of someone else's work, but it does not take away from the commercial value or the ability of the owner of that material to commercialize their work. New work is predominantly original product of user. So it is fair use if the majority of the work is original. It's also fair use if the benefit to the user is predominantly other than commercial. And that means that you're using it for things like research and/or education. The small portion of the original material is used is also considered fair use. However, we also note that it's a slippery term and they don't define limited portion. Therefore, when we loop back into the best thing to do is when using someone else's work, it's best to always give credit where credit is due, even if using only a small part. If you're unsure, then ask for permission. And so how do we ask for permission when we are trying to cite the work within the context of writing our papers? Let's look at some legal implications of copyright versus plagiarism. When we think of copyright, we look at it, it's a legal violation, copyright infringement. Penalties include things like the infringer pays the actual dollar amount of damages and profits, the infringer pays for all attorney fees and court costs, the court can issue an injunction to stop the infringing acts, the court can impound the illegal works, and if severe enough, the infringer can go to jail. But what about plagiarism? Again, when we talk about plagiarism, it's in the context of our college classroom or our educational classroom spaces where you are composing projects, texts in those communities. So how does it apply at the college level? Most colleges and universities have policies on cheating and plagiarism, and consequences could include things like failing the class, all the way to probation, suspension, and sometimes even expulsion. So what is the policy at Tallahassee Community College? Our policy falls under the academic dishonesty policy. Academic integrity is key to success in college. While collaboration and using resources assists with learning, the challenge is to properly cite resources. So let's think about that. In an academic environment or a learning environment, we want to be able to learn from others, to use others' works in order to bring about new knowledge and new understanding. That's a part of the academic community. So in no way, shape, or form are we saying that you're not using or learning from others in order to bring about a better understanding for yourself or even create new knowledge. However, we are saying that when you do that, you want to properly cite the work. So TCC's policy with regards to plagiarism or academic dishonesty in general is as follows. The college is committed to building a community of learning where the foundation of academic work is intellectual integrity, credibility, and trust. It is essential that all members of the TCC community understand our shared standards of academic dishonesty. All cases of academic dishonesty shall be reported to the Student Judicial Office using the appropriate procedures and/or forms established through the Student Code of Conduct. If it is determined appropriate, the college shall take the necessary disciplinary action against any student involved in alleged violation of academic honesty in accordance with the college. And this is policy 10-12 in the Student Code of Conduct. It further states that the college reserves the right to suspend, dismiss, or expel any student from the college for a violation of the Student Code of Conduct, given due process and procedures are followed in accordance with the established procedures. So let's take a look at some of the types of plagiarism. The first one we want to look at, which is typically the most well-known and sadly one of the most common types of plagiarism, and that is simply copying. If you copy someone else's work and put your name on it, you've plagiarized. So for example, if you took this paragraph, which was taken from the book Shyness, What It Is, What to Do About It, and you simply plopped it into your paper without correctly citing it, it means that you've committed plagiarism. So copying is pretty straightforward. If a writer copies word for word the text from the book that we just saw in the example, does not acknowledge it in any way as being that author's book, then the writer has committed plagiarism. The second type of plagiarism we want to talk about is something called patchwork plagiarism. And this is similar to copying and probably the second most common type of plagiarism. So patchwork plagiarism occurs when the plagiarizer borrows the phrases and clauses from the original source and weaves them into his or her own writing without putting the phrases in quotation marks or citing the author. So for example, in this paragraph, several of the phrases or portions of the paragraph that are in blue were taken word for word from the original work, but we notice that no citation has been given. Now, Had the author of this passage put the colored phrases in quotation marks and added a citation after the quotation, such as Zimbardo 62, which is an MLA citation for the book where that quote or where the material came from, then the author would have been safe. Without the quotation marks and the proper citation, the author has committed plagiarism. Another type of plagiarism is called paraphrasing plagiarism. This occurs when the plagiarizer paraphrases or summarizes another's work without citing the source, even changing the words a little or using synonyms, but retaining the author's essential thoughts, sentence structure, and/or style without citing the source is still considered plagiarism. So, for example, you see the text that is in blue is an example of paraphrasing plagiarism because the writer simply shifted a word around, added words in between a direct quote, or added synonyms to convey the same message that was in the original book. Now, had the author of this paragraph used footnotes or parenthetical citation to acknowledge Dr. Zimbardo's work, he or she would have been in the clear. However, since the author represents these ideas as his or her own and does not acknowledge Dr. Zimbardo, it's plagiarism. Remember, passing off someone else's ideas as your own is also considered plagiarism. So if you are using the author's ideas or what they have published, and you are simply putting them in different words or moving things around, but the idea is there and it belongs to them, you need to give them credit for it. The final type that we're going to talk about is unintentional plagiarism. And this occurs when the writer incorrectly quotes and/or incorrectly cites a source they are using. So, how is this plagiarism if the author didn't mean to do it? If a writer has incorrectly quoted or incorrectly cited a source, it could be misconstrued as dishonesty on the writer's part. The dishonest usage of another's work is most often considered plagiarism. Therefore, the incorrect use of another's work, whether it's intentional or not, could be taken for real plagiarism. And we can't read minds. Your audience, your instructor, whoever is encountering your work, does not have you sitting next to them pointing out areas where you had mistakenly or unintentionally miscited or misquoted something. So we don't know what you meant to do. So how can you avoid plagiarism? Well, avoiding plagiarism is quite simple. The best method for avoiding it is to simply be honest. When you've used a source in your paper, give credit where it's due. Acknowledge the author of the original work you've used. Another way to avoid plagiarism is to use your own work as often as possible. Quoting and citing sources is required and inevitable when doing research, of course. That's how you back up your own work. But using someone else's work excessively can be construed as plagiarism. Another way to avoid is to quote and/or cite your sources properly. This includes citing yourself. Yes, you can plagiarize yourself. This includes turning in a paper to a class that was previously written and submitted for another class. In order to properly quote your sources, you should consult the style manual that would be appropriate for the research. In most cases, your professor will tell you which style manual would be preferred. If your professor doesn't indicate which manual to use, be sure to ask. In order to properly cite your sources, you should also consult the style manual that would be appropriate for the research. So, for example, Modern Language Association, or MLA, is most typically used in departments of English and humanities. APA, or American Psychological Association, is typically seen in fields or departments such as education, psychology, and sciences, while Chicago and Turbine styles are typically seen in areas of business, history, and fine arts. Again, your professor should tell you or may tell you. Sometimes they'll give you a choice based on the field you're going into. Other times, such as the context for our composition courses, we use the style that is most often used in that field. And in our case, it's Modern Languages Association, or MLA. So how do we detect plagiarism? One of the ways we detect plagiarism is using a tool such as Turnitin, which is an application that does some originality checks for us. Now, without that, there are other ways for us to detect plagiarism. In many cases, a large shift in voice of the text is a key indicator that something or a portion of that is not your own voice, is not your own work. However, in our case, we use the application Turnitin, which allows not only us as instructors, but you as students to engage in the process of understanding plagiarism. Every time you submit a document, you'll notice it's asking you to check a box that says, I understand that this document is going to go through a process of originality checking. It then will give a percentage that it comes back with. It also gives us nice, rich feedback in the form of a document that will highlight each instance where that piece of text is detected elsewhere. It goes so far as to linking you and I to where that work came from. That includes letting us know where that particular work had been submitted in the past. So when avoiding plagiarism, understanding it is key. Understanding plagiarism is the key to avoiding it. Make sure you understand the guidelines for citing the work using the format required for the work, such as MLA, APA, etc. If you don't know, ask. We are here to help, and we provide numerous resources for understanding plagiarism as well as the formatting guidelines. Remember, it's your learning and it's your responsibility to understand not only plagiarism, but understand the resources that you can use to correctly format your text. I hope this quick review has been helpful in your understanding of not only plagiarism, the types of plagiarism, the terminology we use when discussing plagiarism, but really best practices for how to avoid it.